Okay, I want to very quickly mention this. There is a period, you can see it here, it's in the so-called Woodland Period, 300 BC to AD 250, called the Hopewell Tradition, or sometimes called the Hopewell Culture, named after a site in the United States, where you can see is characterized what he says, significant increases in population and local aggregation, so more people living in the same place, right? Settlements get larger. By the development of a ceremonial and mortuary complex with strong evidence of status differences. What's another way of saying status differences? Hierarchy, class, right? So remember, we see that when we have a redistributive economy, redistributive economies create inequalities, right? Because you need to have people to coordinate, manage the redistribution. So another way of saying that is, as we move forward in time, as the principles of redistribution inside this kind of an environment become more developed, as a natural function of that, we see greater distinction in the status of the people living inside, right? We have to formalize the role. We see by increasing interaction between groups over a wide area of the eastern United States, one feature of which is the extensive trading of exotic raw materials, such as copper, silver, mica, gelatin, obsidian, shells, and water pearls. So I draw your attention to this to note, right? We follow our story so far. We started out with a few random people trying to live in the very difficult woods of Ontario and northeastern United States. Move forward and start to find the first gestures towards more efficient forms of population sustenance, banding together, sharing resources, and so on. By the time we've moved forward many thousands of years, now we're around the era of 300 to 250, 300 BCE to 250 CE, we're starting to see very significant advances in terms of the social complexity that's formed. Obviously, when we start to see increasing elements of social inequality, that's an example of a more complex society. But I think of particular interest to us is the fact that we start to see trading networks emerge. Where you have a trading network, another way of saying that is you start to see markets emerging. These are not indigenous or endogenous markets. These appear to be exogenous markets. They are markets in long-distance trade of high-value goods between different groups, right? Is that clear? So it's not to say that the groups are trading within themselves, but they're trading with outsiders across long distances. And that suggests these kinds of limited but high-value products that we're starting to see then the emergence of some kind of a trading regime. Yes, there's a question.
So was it the trading that generated the inequality, or what was it the underlying reason for the classes to be separated?
Yes, to reiterate what we mentioned before, as Polanyi points out, and as noted in some of the other readings we're looking at, if you produce surplus and you want to redistribute the surplus to other people in the community, other people in the society, right? You have to have this principle of what Polanyi calls centricity. You can't just distribute it bilaterally, it's too chaotic. If you're in a very, very small group of people, you can distribute based on what he calls the principle of obligation or reciprocity. But once your population becomes, say, several hundred, let alone several thousand, you're going to need to have a mechanism for redistribution. In order to redistribute, what do? You have to take all of the surplus and put it in one place. Today, we think of it as the government, which collects taxes, right? That's the classic example of redistribution. But in primitive societies, it was literally like a warehouse or a storage place or like a basement or something. So you bring your surplus fish or your surplus grain, you would owe it as a tax. The idea then is you need someone who's going to be responsible for defining what gets redistributed, how it gets redistributed. In other words, a person in the center where it all comes in, right? So far, so good? A manager of the process. Simply by virtue of organizing that redistribution, that creates the kind of inequality that I'm talking about, right? Because if you're in the middle of this stream of surplus goods coming into the center, you're going to have more authority by virtue of that position. So that's why we talk about inequality. It's not the inequality we think of as maybe inequality of wealth. It's not even necessarily inequality in terms of social prestige. It simply means that there's not a militant equality amongst people. It looks quite different depending on where we find it or what it's doing. As we saw last time in the Polanyi discussion, at its most extreme, it produces things like the pharaohs of Egypt, who are at the sort of, at the very center of a system of redistribution and have enormous amounts of power compared to everybody else. At its most basic, it looks like this, which are headmen, chiefs, who coordinate the collection and redistribution of these resources. That's the inequality that I'm talking about. And a second order of inequality would also be that the goods that are redistributed out are not necessarily redistributed out equally. Not everybody necessarily gets the same share. Sometimes you'll find that what people get is regulated by social convention. Thank you for the question. So just to mention that by 300 BCE to 300 CE or 250, not only do we have these more complex forms internally in society, but we start to see elements of a long-distance trading network. And note what's being traded. It's obviously in its infancy because the only things that are worth trading are things that are high value and very rare, easy to carry and the like. So we're not looking at very intense trade, but we do see the principle being established. So the significance then of the Hopewell period is in internal terms, we see the development of more sophisticated social forms, and in external terms, we see the incipients, the beginning of a kind of economic pattern of trade.